The scientific discoveries are all based on what was happening in the 18th century. Now, science in the 18th century was really about collection of data. So when they were out there in Siberia and across the ocean and into North America, what they were doing is documenting all the known species of plants and animals and where they lived. They were taking, measurements of climate. They were looking at the soil, the geology, the type of rocks. The amount of information that they sent back from that was truly staggering. It was an incredible achievement. The cartographic discoveries of the expedition were equally as fantastic as the scientific ones. Teams of cartographers produced an accurate chart of the entire northern coastline of Siberia, which is incredible considering the weather conditions they operated under. They also, when they sailed across to Alaska, they charted roughly the coast of Alaska too. And in the process of doing that, they actually disproved several long-standing myths associated with the Pacific Ocean. Specifically, that there was, a cluster of islands out there in the middle of the ocean. One of them was called Dagama Land, which were supposedly, as always the case with mythical islands, covered in jewels and gems and gold, and the Russian authorities, of course, would have loved to have access to this newfound source of riches. Unfortunately for them, it turned out to be a myth. Like most people, I've heard the word Bering before just by looking at a map and seeing the Bering Strait. And when I was looking into the early research of this project, I looked into the life of Vitus Bering, and it drew me to the Great Northern Expedition, and I was absolutely staggered by the sheer size and accomplishments of this expedition. And I think it's easily on par with the famous voyages of Captain James Cook in the South Pacific or the Lewis and Clark expedition in the United States. The reason why we don't know very much about it now is because the Russian government essentially suppressed all information of the expedition afterwards for two reasons. Firstly, because they didn't want a disaster being associated with their grand, ambitious scientific expedition. And secondly, they wanted to claim any economic benefits exclusively to themselves. The book hasn't been translated into Russian yet, although I'm hopeful that it will be. But I have had some interesting feedback from some people in Alaska. Some readers told me how much they enjoyed it, and I've been talking to some people about some review that's coming in certain magazines. And even in Alaska, this is a very little known story, so they're very excited about it. I didn't actually have to travel to Russia to gain any of the information that I used for this book. I mean, we really are in an age of incredible quantities of information flooding around, and I was able to source all of my material online, and coincidentally, a lot of it had recently been translated into English. So oddly enough, this book was actually one of the easiest books that I wrote in terms of research. There's a lot of affiliated stories to the Great Northern Expedition that I detailed in Island of the Blue Foxes. I mentioned some of them. A lot of them don't have very much meat to them, unfortunately. The people who went on to those stories didn't leave any literate or interesting recollections of what they did. So, from an author's point of view, there really isn't a story to tell other than to mention that it had been done. Now, I think it's a bit of a cliche that people often say that, history is written by the victors. And I think it's equally important to mention that history is written about people who left literate, interesting, insightful recollections of their life and their times and the adventures that they had. So in that sense, the pen really is mightier than the sword. I'd love it if they made a movie of the book. Not only would I get the money, but I'd just love to see that drawn out on a big screen. There has been some interest from the US on film rights, but nothing has come of it yet.